In this video, we're going to look at how to use the distance formula when we're given coordinates that are in fraction form. So we're asked to find the distance between the coordinates 1/2, -1/2, and 3/4, 1/2. Now take a look at the way I scaled my axes here. I decided to use a scale of 1/4. 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1. I decided to do this so my points wouldn't be really scrunched together if I made this a 1. So using this scale, here's the coordinate 1/2, -1/2, and here's the coordinate 3/4, 1/2. Now we can't use the Pythagorean theorem exactly the same way we did before in this case because although this is one block, it's representative of 1/4 instead of 1. If you're really good at fractions, you could say that this is 1/4, this is 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 1. But we're going to see how that actually works out over in the formula and then how to reduce it correctly. So here's our formula, and we have 3/4, which is x2, minus 1/2, which is x1, minus is part of the formula, plus 1/2, y2, minus a -1/2 squared. Now in this class we have to reduce our fractions, make common denominators, and all of those things. But I'm going to do this problem on 2 different calculators so you can see how to get your calculator to work the fractions and spend less time on creating common denominators and more time focusing on giving a college algebra level solution. So the first calculator I'm going to use is the graphing calculator. So let me show you how you're going to do that. So you're going to take your graphing calculator and type in 3/4 minus 1/2. I don't want to see any decimals. And what does the calculator do? It gives you a decimal. But your calculator has this math button. So you're going to hit the math button, and you'll notice that the first option there is to change it to a fraction. So I'm going to hit that, and then I'm going to hit enter again, and I have this fraction here, 1/4. Maybe you can do it in your head. You have to make a common denominator. 3/4 minus 2/4 is 1/4. And so let's do the next one. So now I'm going to do 1/2 minus sign, and then the -1/2. Now that's going to change to addition. So what you really have is 1/2 plus 1/2. Maybe you also can do that in your head. You get a 1. So now I have 1/4 squared plus 1 squared. So now I'm going to go to my calculator and I'm going to do 1/4 squared. To be honest, actually I should do parentheses because if it wasn't a 1 in the numerator that wouldn't work out. But I do get the same answer because it was a 1 in the numerator. Now I don't want to see any decimals. I want to see a fraction in reduced form. So I'm going to hit that math button again, change it back to a fraction. There's the 1/16. This one though you should be able to do in your head. 1 times 1 is 1, 4 times 4 is 16, there's the 1/16. 1 squared I hope we don't need a calculator for. That's 1. Now we have to add together 1/16 and 1. So I'm going to take this 1/16, add 1 to it. Again, don't want to see a decimal. I'm going to hit the math button, change it to a fraction. Here's my 17/16. Now I'm done with the adding part, but what I'm going to need to do is reduce this radical. So in mathematics, we don't like to have a square root in the denominator. It's just a funny little rule. It's called unreduced irrational if we do that. So the nice rule is if you have a fraction under a square root sign, you can take the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator. What's even nicer about this problem is that the square root of 16 can evaluate to 4. So your final answer only has a square root in the numerator, the square root of 17, because you reduced square root of 16 to 4. So I'm going to do the problem one more time, but I'm going to do it with the scientific calculator that I generally use so that you can see how to do it on both calculators. The fraction work is a little bit more complicated on this calculator, but it can still do it. So coming back up to this line, I'm going to do 3/4 minus 1/2, and it's going to give me a decimal. On this calculator, to get the decimal, look for this button or some button that looks kind of like a fraction on it. We're going to use this button, and we're going to use this button on top of it. Look on the calculator screen, you'll see FD. So this is fraction to decimal. So we're going to use a combination of these buttons to get the right fraction and decimal. So the first one I'm going to use is this FD. So I'm going to hit the second key, FD. It's changing fraction to decimal or vice versa. And there's the 1/4 right here. You can also make a common denominator and do it old school. Next I'm going to do this piece. So I'm going to clear that out. 1/2 minus a -1/2. That gives me this 1, which I think you can also do in your head, right? You know that's adding. So next up, I'm going to take this 1/4 and square it in the calculator or in my head, because squaring 1/4 isn't too hard. But it does give me a decimal, which I don't want. I want a fraction. So I'm going to hit that second fraction decimal again. Oops, wait, hold on. That was an extra button there. There's the 1/16. And then the 1 squared is 1. Next up, I'm going to take the 1/16 and add 1 to it. Now this is where this calculator gets a little funny. 1 is also 16/16, so that's how you could get 17/16 doing it in your head. But using the calculator, now I have this. If I go and change it fraction to decimal, I think this calculator is going to give me a mixed number. Let's see. Yeah. So reading this is a whole number 1 and 1/16. We don't really want mixed numbers, and so that's where this button comes in. So you can see that on here it has a mixed number to an improper fraction, which is what we really want. So I'm hitting this button, this ABC button. There's the 17/16 that we want. We don't want a mixed number in there because we can't reduce the mixed number, but we can reduce 17/16 following the problem through the same way. So I encourage you to choose your battles. If you want to do the fractions by hand, by all means do that. Otherwise, make sure you're comfortable with your calculator doing it so that you can figure out these problems and write your final answer with no decimals as reduced, radical, and simplified fractions.